What up, watch fans, and welcome back once again to I Like Watches, and thank you so much for tuning into volume 2 of my stainless steel comparison series, in which I'm going to compare the steel finishing of 6 watches: a Seiko, an Islander, an Orient, a Beaufort, a Venetian Eco, and a Christopher Ward. The value of these watches does vary quite a bit, but we learnt after the first video, volume 1 if you like, that price doesn't necessarily guarantee a better finished watch. So yeah, let's take a look at these 6 watches side by side. Right, before we get into it, let me just quickly show you the watches that will be included in this video. We've got a Seiko SBTR, an Islander ISL-91, an Orient Mako Vintage, a Beaufort Sea Trekker, a beautiful Venetian Eco with that mother of pearl dial, and a Christopher Ward 12. This is the 36mm version. So yes, there is a bit of a spread in terms of value, and yeah, that was the case in my previous comparison video, and it didn't seem to make a jot of difference, did it? I included in that previous video a Grand Seiko and a Timex. The Grand Seiko was almost £3,000, the Timex was £80, and then there was 4 other watches that sit in between those two, and yeah, the results were really quite surprising. So let's take a look at the results for this selection of watches. The first thing I looked at was the brushing on the cases, and these were all a little bit more similar than they were in the previous video. I'm not seeing any bad brushing here. There is some more coarse brushing, some finer sort of satin brushing. The Christopher Ward and the Beaufort are perhaps the two most coarsely finished cases, and I think the Islander has the sort of smoothest, almost sort of satin-like brushing on the case, and the other 3 are fairly similar, aren't they? So yes, there is a difference between the 6 watches, but I'm not really seeing anything good or bad at this stage. Then I looked at the polished surfaces on the case. Now the SBTR is by far and away the cheapest watch. There's only one polished facet at the end of the lug, and actually it seems to be, yeah, fairly nicely done. That transition between the sort of bright light and the sort of darker reflection, that line between the two is really what I'm looking at here, and yeah, it doesn't look too bad at all. Same for the Islander watch, actually. Now the Orient, it's a very small surface, but yeah, there's a little bit of a sort of wobbliness to that transition, isn't there? Whereas on the Beaufort Sea Trekker, look at that, that distinction between the bright white reflection and the sort of darker grey reflection is really quite crisp. So the polishing on the Beaufort Sea Trekker seems to be very good. It seems to be good on the Venetian Eco, perhaps not quite as good as it is on the Beaufort, and the Christopher Ward, again, perhaps not quite as smooth as it is on the Beaufort Sea Trekker, but those sort of more expensive 3 watches seems pretty good on all of them, to be honest. Next, I took a closer look at the corners and the transitions between brushing and polishing on the cases. Now, the cheapest watch, the SBTR Seiko, doesn't have any polishing on the case, so I just zoomed into the corner, and as you can see, there's some over brushing there. It's not particularly crisp or tidy, is it? I think that's what we would expect, though, from a very affordable Seiko. The Islander is, yeah, a little bit rough as well. It's not as rough as it is on the Orient, though. Look at that. Yeah, the over brushing, that sort of spikiness isn't fantastic. The Beaufort Sea Trekker looks to be pretty crisp, and I think the Venetian Eco is even more crisp. I think the Venetian Eco and the Christopher Ward undoubtedly have the most crisp transition, the most crisply finished corners on the case, and I think you would expect that given the prices. Now this is new for this video. I didn't include this shot in my previous comparison video, volume 1 if you like. I've zoomed into the gap between the lugs and the end links, and I think this is quite telling, isn't it? I'm surprised actually at how straight and even, and actually how small the gap is on the Seiko. That's pretty good. I think the 2 weakest watches by far are the Islander and the Orient. The Orient in particular, I mean, look at the size of the gap, and it's not exactly an even gap, is it? It sort of opens up towards the end of the lug. The Beaufort looks okay. This watch actually comes on a rubber strap. The bracelet is sort of aftermarket, or it's made by Beaufort, but you have to buy it separately. And yeah, that fits pretty well. The Venetian Eco, yeah, definitely the best. Now, I say it's the best because the Christopher Ward has integrated bracelets, so it's not really a sort of traditional end link that we're looking at, but I have to say the tolerances on the Christopher Ward, yeah, are spot on, aren't they? There's almost no gap there. Next, I zoomed in on the bracelets to have a look at the brushing, and a little bit like the cases, it's all fairly even. I think the most coarse brushing again is on the Christopher Ward, which I don't mind at all. It matches the case very, very nicely, and yeah, the other watches, even the more affordable ones, seem to be very nicely brushed, so no complaints there. Now we're looking at the spaces between the links on the bracelet. Now, some of these bracelets are made up of individual links that have been stuck together, and some are made up of a single piece of steel that have been made to look like they are made of separate pieces of steel. So some have a genuine gap and some have a fake gap. The Seiko looks pretty good for the money. That is the cheapest watch, of course. The Islander also looks pretty good. I'm a little bit disappointed with the Orient. They have sort of fake, or created I should say, a sort of fake separation which looks a little bit rough. I don't like it. I do prefer bracelets that have actual sections of steel pulled together to make an individual link. The Beaufort Sea Tracker bracelet looks pretty good, and the Venetian Eco has done something a little bit different. They've got H links with those sort of polished oval sections, and yeah, I mean, that looks okay. But again, the Christopher Ward, the tolerances, look at that. That's pretty good. Not all of the watches have polishing on the bracelets, but I have taken shots of the 4 bracelets that have polished sections, and they're all pretty good. In fact, the Venetian Eco, I think, has the best polished sections on the bracelet, but that could be because that polished surface is a sort of major surface, isn't it? It's a top surface. It's a surface that, well, they need to look pretty good because it's the main surface on the bracelet. So I'm not surprised to see that that particular surface is beautifully polished. The transitions, I have to say, on the Christopher Ward between the top surface being brushed and those sort of faceted angled sections towards the side of the bracelet, that transitional line, very, very nice. But yeah, nothing really here to complain about. Now, last but not least, I have zoomed in on the 12 o'clock markers. Obviously, the Islander doesn't have an applied index, but I've still taken a shot of that, and it seems to be nicely printed. That is loom printed onto a raised section of the dial, and it seems to be fairly crisp. I'm not seeing any dust or debris on the dial, and that was something I commented on in my full review. I'm impressed with the Seiko SBTR, actually. I commented on this in my full review. The grooves on those applied indices, they are of course designed to give a little light play on the dial, which I really, really like, and that seems to be fairly crisply done, and the facets on that applied index look pretty smooth. And the Orient, there's a few imperfections on the loom, and well, the sort of frame around the outside of the loom doesn't seem to be particularly crisp, does it? I mean, it's not bad, it's just not amazing. The Beaufort Sea Tracker looks to be nicely done. That's interesting, that one. It's got a sort of raised bed of loom on top of the applied indice, or index I should say. The corners are fairly crisp, not the most crisp I've seen. It's quite a tall applied index, isn't it? The Venetian Ecos look very, very crisply finished in terms of the corners, although there's a few imperfections on that section on the right hand side, a few scratches and stuff, which I was a little bit disappointed with. And I think, as we would expect, the Christopher Ward indexes are the best. A mix of brushed and polished facets. They're very nicely done. I'm not seeing any imperfections. They seem to be very smooth and nicely finished. So I think in this particular instance, unlike Volume 1, we are seeing a more direct correlation between how much you would spend on these watches and the quality of the finishing. The Seiko in the first video, Volume 1, was really quite disappointing in places, but this Seiko SBTR has actually surprised me. I think it's probably better finished overall than the Islander and the Orient. But of course, the Beaufort and Venetian Eco and Christopher Ward, undoubtedly the best finished watches. And if I was to pick one as the best finished, it would, yeah, definitely be the Christopher Ward. But I think we would expect that. So, yeah, no huge surprises coming from this particular lineup, but I will continue to sort of pull out 6 watches every now and then and produce these videos, and hopefully we'll get a good overall picture of, yeah, which brands and which watches we like the finishing of and which ones we don't. Right, guys, as always, a massive thank you from me to you for tuning in. I do really, really appreciate it. If you enjoy these videos, let me know in the comments section. Take care.